Good afternoon. My name is Eli Merifeld. I'm the CEO here at the Zekelman Holocaust Center, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this afternoon's program, Love, Lies, and Justice on the Trail of a Nazi Fugitive. Thank you to our program supporters, Robin and Leo Eisenberg, Susan and David Fieber, Barbara and Edward Klarman, Stuart Shear, Sarah Geyer and Scott Strauss, Shelley and Joel Tauber, Stacy and Mark Wittenberg, and the PNC Foundation. I want to reach a special thank you also to our community partners, the Michigan State University History Department and the Michael and Elaine Serling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel. And now I'd like to introduce you to our special guest, Philippe Sands. Philippe is a human rights lawyer and author of 17 books on international law, including The Ratline. In addition to his work as president of the English Pen, Sands is a CNN and BBC World Service contributor. He is also professor of laws and director of the Center on International Court and Tribunals at University College London. After Philippe's presentation, there'll be a Q&A, so as the program progresses, please write your questions in the Q&A section located at the bottom of the screen. Philippe, welcome, and thank you. Welcome, and I thank you for being our guest this afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Eli, and my big thanks to the Zekelman Holocaust Center. I'll start that again. I've just unmuted. I'm so sorry. Thank you, Eli, for your nice words of introduction. It's a real privilege for me to be joining the Zekelman Holocaust Center. I really hope to visit in person very soon. I'm speaking to you from London, England. It's nighttime. It's an autumn evening. It's been a very beautiful day. It's uncustomarily warm in London, and we're not quite used to that, and we worry a little bit about what that's about. So I thought what I'd do is take 20-25 minutes to set the context for the story of this book, which is part of a series that I'm writing. I can say a little bit more about that in due course, how I got to write it, what I discovered, and what happens next. The book has, in fact, recently been bought by a major German production house to make an 8-part HBO-style series. Whether that ever gets made, of course, in the world of television and film, one never knows, but we shall see. It is, I think, a unique story. To tell you how this started, you really need to go back to 2010. Out of the blue, I received an invitation to give a lecture on the cases that I do before international courts and tribunals on crimes against humanity and genocide. You've probably heard quite a lot about those concepts, the legal concepts in the context of the Holocaust Center's work, but also in relation to current things in Ukraine, in Myanmar, and in many places, sadly, many other parts of the world. So I get this invitation. It comes from a university in a city that, to be frank, I had not really heard of, the city of Lviv. Today, everyone has heard of it because it's in Western Ukraine, and it's where many journalists are reporting from in relation to the terrible conflict that is underway now. And the university there, the law faculty, asked me to come to Lviv to come and deliver a lecture on the cases that I do, as I mentioned, on crimes against humanity and genocide. I Googled Lviv. I tried to see where it was, and I immediately discovered that Lviv was also known as Lwów when it was part of Poland, and Lemberg when it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire until 1919. And of course, the moment I learned it was called Lemberg and it was the same place, I accepted the invitation. Why? Because my grandfather was born in Lemberg in 1904, and in fact, he was the only survivor from a very large family of more than 80 people from that city and from towns around who survived the Holocaust. So I accepted the invitation. I wanted to really, I suppose, find out where my grandfather lived. He had never talked to me about what had happened before 1945. I knew him very well. He lived until 1997. We were very, very close. But he never talked about what had happened to him or to his family before 1945. So I go off to Lviv with my mum, with my aunt, with our then 15-year-old son, one of our 3 children. And just to put this in context, I'm married to an American. My wife is a New Yorker, so I'm the only member of the family who doesn't have US nationality or citizenship. And I discovered many things in the city of Lviv in October 2010. Most significantly, in preparing for the trip, I discovered remarkably that the man who had invented the concept of crimes against humanity came from the city of Lviv. His name was Hersch Lauterpacht. And then I discovered that the man who invented the concept of genocide, also in 1945, also passed through the city of Lviv. He was a student at the law faculty that had invited me. So, of course, I arrive at the University of Lviv in October 2010 with this magical news. They've asked me to give a lecture on the cases that I do on crimes against humanity and genocide. And I bring the news that the concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide were invented by men who came from their city and who had studied at their law school. You almost couldn't invent it. So I started writing a book about it, about my grandfather, Leon Buchholz, Hersch Lauterpacht, Raphael Lemkin. The book would come to be known as East-West Street. It's right now been translated, I think, into 30 languages. It's sold hundreds of thousands of copies. And in the course of doing the research, I came across a 4th man who, in a sense, is at the epicenter of the story. Some of you will have heard of him. His name is Hans Frank. He was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer from 1928 to 1932. And he became Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland, on the occupied territory of which so many of the horrors happened. And he was based in Krakow. He became the 4th character in East-West Street. And in writing the book, any of you who've read my books will know I do a tremendous amount of research. It took 5-6 years to write East-West Street. I came to know the son of Hans Frank. And one day, we're now in about 2011, Nicholas Frank, the son, who is a remarkable person, despises his father. The first time I met him, said to me, Philippe, you have to understand I'm against the death penalty in all cases, except in the case of my father. He deserved to die for the crimes that he committed. That gives you a sense of Nicholas Frank. So one day, late 2011, Nicholas says to me, Philippe, your family is from Lviv, from Lemberg, from Lvov. Are you interested in meeting the son of the governor of Lviv, the son of the governor of what was called District Galicia, in part of the government general, Nazi-occupied Poland? And I said, yes, I would be interested. I'm not sure why the son may want to meet me, but yes, of course. And Nicholas told me a little bit more about his father. I knew the name, Otto Wächter. He was an Austrian. Hans Frank was German. Wächter had been a very senior SS officer, became governor of Krakow, was responsible for the creation of the Krakow ghetto, so a absolutely top-table Nazi, working directly with Heinrich Himmler, appointed personally by Adolf Hitler. And in 1942, he becomes governor of District Galicia, based in Lviv. And of course, he is responsible in part for the acts that led to the killing of my grandfather's entire family. So I toddle off to northern Austria with Nicholas Frank to meet the son of Otto Wächter, and I also learn about the wife, Charlotte Wächter. I meet a man who is in his mid-70s, actually a very lovely man, but who has a very different attitude to his father, Otto Wächter, than Nicholas Frank has to his father, Hans Frank. Horst Wächter accepts that his father was deeply involved in the terrible events in that area in the 1940s, but he has decided to believe that his father was nevertheless a good man who somehow unwittingly became involved in these issues. So one thing led to another. I became rather fascinated by Horst Wächter, and I asked him whether I could write a profile of him for a newspaper, for the Financial Times. And he said yes. And that profile was published in May of 2013, and it got a huge amount of interest. It was a profile of Horst and the story of Horst's relationship with his mother, Charlotte Wächter. And in writing the article, which you can go online and find on the website of the Financial Times, My Father, the Good Nazi, Horst showed me some documents and some photo albums, which were remarkable. Material from the period 1938 to 1945. And I was fascinated by this material, particularly the photo albums. You had pictures of Otto in his, appalling SS uniform. And you had family pictures interspersed with some of these dreadful images. And it fascinated me. The article appeared in the Financial Times, and then the BBC, having found the article, thought we're interested in my relationship with Horst, asked whether we could make a documentary film, which we did, and that came out in 2015. We filmed in 2014. We went together to Lviv, Nicholas, Frank, Horst Wächter, and me. And in the course of that visit, we spent about a week there together in the summer of 2014. Horst said we should go and attend the commemoration of, as he puts it, my father's Waffen-SS Galicia division, which we did halfway between Lviv and a town called Brody. And it was, to be very frank, a dreadful day. Hundreds of people running around dressed in Waffen-SS uniforms, totally thrilled to see Horst Wächter, the son of the governor who had created the Waffen-SS Galicia division. Later that evening, I interviewed Nicholas, and like me, he was horrified by what we had seen. But he went further, and on camera, in an interview, he said to me, "You know what, Philippe, I'm so appalled by what I've seen and by Horst engaging with these individuals that I'm beginning to wonder if he might not be a new kind of Nazi." I actually disagreed with that. I didn't think that Horst was or is a Nazi. He recognizes the Holocaust has happened. He recognizes it as a most dreadful thing. What he seeks to do is to minimize the role of his father. His line is, "It is my duty as a son to find the good in my father." Anyway, I do this interview with Nicholas. Horst becomes aware of what Nicholas has said and breaks off relations with Nicholas. And Horst then says to me, "Philippe, how can I prove that I'm not a Nazi?" And I'm a lawyer, I'm a litigator. Some of you who are watching may be lawyers, and you'll understand that to prove a negative is often a very difficult thing. So I reflected about Horst's question, and then I came up with an idea, and I said to him the following: "Horst, you've got 10,000 pages of family archive. All the letters written between your parents from 1928 when they met until 1949 when he died in mysterious circumstances in a Vatican-run hospital in Rome. You've got their diaries, you've got their photographs, you've got a myriad of extraordinary documents. Why don't you make them available to a Holocaust museum?" And I'm sorry I didn't think of the Holocaust Center in Michigan. That would have been a wonderful place to house this material. But I had been working with the Holocaust Museum in the United States, Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. I knew the archivists there and the curators, and the wonderful Anatol Steck. And I asked him, Anatol, whether he might be interested in the material. And he said, "Of course, are you kidding me? We've never seen material like this before." So I put the proposition to Horst, and Horst said, "Yes, that's a terrific idea." And I said to Horst, "You know what? Nazis tend not to give this kind of material to museums." He said, "I know, I'm very happy to give the material." So the museum sent 4 people over to digitize all the material. And once it had been digitized, Horst said to me, would you like a copy of the material?" And I said, "Yes, actually, I would be curious to see it." And about 2 weeks later, a USB stick came through my post box containing 10,000 pages of material on the life and love of Otto and Charlotte Wächter. It was extraordinary material, 99.9% of it in German, but utterly fascinating. Fascinating, not because it dealt only with the period up until 1945, when the war ended on May the 9th, and Otto's role and his relationship with Charlotte throughout that period, but because it then continued. And this, for me, really was the heart of the story. It contained all the material from 1945 until July 1949, when Wächter died in Rome. And that was an utterly fascinating story. I worked with 3 research assistants for 5 years, transcribing, translating, understanding, interpreting the material. And my book, The Ratline, tells the story of Otto and Charlotte Wächter from the moment they met in 1928 until the moment he died in 1949. The part from the early years is pretty ghastly. Otto was an early Nazi already at university in Vienna in 1921. He was active on the streets, sort of hustling and beating up Jews. He was arrested for that, and he served his first term in prison. In the early 1930s, he was the leader of the Nazi Party in a district of Vienna. And in the context of that work, he, in 1934, was responsible for the murder of the Austrian Chancellor, Engelbert Dollfuss. He flees to Germany. He joins the SS in 1936, and he starts working with the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst. He works for Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, and in the same office as Adolf Eichmann. That is the level of Otto Wächter's name. But of course, I don't know that name, and you probably don't know that name, because his family, his widow, has done an excellent job in sort of whitewashing him out of history. In 1938, having been joined by his wife in Berlin and their 2 children, they have 3 more children. He returns on the 15th of March, 1938, to Vienna and stands on the balcony of the Heldenplatz, literally 2 meters, 6 feet from Adolf Hitler. He was that close to power. And after the events, the terrible events on the Heldenplatz, he and Charlotte, who's also present, go into the building, and they walk down the huge marble staircase inside the Hofburg Palace. And at the bottom, Otto says to Charlotte, "My darling Hümchen," that's what he called her, "I now have a decision to make. I can either resume my lucrative legal practice as a commercial lawyer, or I could accept the offer from Arthur Seyss-Inquart." Some of you may know the name. He was indicted and put on trial at Nuremberg and was convicted and sentenced to death and hanged. He was Horst Wächter's godfather, so there is a very close relationship. And so Otto says, "Well, my darling, what should I do?" And it is Charlotte who says, "Take the political position. I want the power. I want the Mercedes. I want the houses. I want the power." And this is when I saw that material that I came to be deeply interested in Charlotte. For me, Charlotte is the beating heart of this story, the spouse, the loving, intelligent, dreadful spouse who's egging her husband on in his deeds. His first job in Vienna, because he goes into government as state secretary, is to remove all Jews from public office. 17,000 Jews are removed from public office within a year, everyone from the Minister of Justice to postmen, bank workers, thousands of people. And he does the job so well that he's promoted in October 1939, when the war has begun, to governor of Nazi-occupied Krakow. And he is responsible in 1940 and 41 for the construction of the Krakow ghetto. So really very much at the top table. He does that job so brilliantly, and there are some absolutely dreadful documents in the material, and this is what I write about in the book, but very dispassionately, in a very distanced way. For example, November 1939, and it is the private letters that are so incredible. He writes to his wife. She is in Vienna. He's in Krakow. My darling Hümchen. Marvelous days in Krakow. Lots of important people coming to visit me. Lots of ministers, senior Nazis. Even the Vienna Philharmonic has come to perform in my city. A little bit of local difficulty. There's been an attempt on the life of the governor, and tomorrow I have to have 50 Poles shot. So the private letters describe his role in the acts of killing, and that is, of course, significant material. From Krakow, he moves to Lviv and becomes governor for 2 years, and he is responsible for the transportations that lead to the deaths of over 1 million human beings. He is by now indicted for mass murder by the British government, by the American government, by the Polish government. And in 1944, the Red Army in July occupies Lviv and he flees. He spends the last year of the war working in Italy, separated from Charlotte and the children. And then in May 1945, he makes one last call to her and then disappears off the face of the earth and is not seen again, if you look at the public record, until July 1949, when he is found living in Rome, dying in a Vatican-run hospital in circumstances which are unclear. Has he been poisoned? Has he got Weil's disease? Has he fallen ill? At this point, we don't know. But Horst's materials that he gives me and that he gives the Holocaust material, and if you're interested, you can just after this Zoom or at some point this week, just go onto the Holocaust Memorial website, type in the Wächter archive, and you can see the materials for yourselves. If you speak German, you'll be able to understand it. If you don't, you'll get a sense of the photographs and the other bits and bobs. But we then learn what happened. He goes into hiding after May 45, actually very close to Charlotte, just about 30 or 40 miles away in the Austrian mountains. And she goes and sees him every 2 or 3 weeks. He is not alone. We discover he's living with a young man called Burkhard Ratman, who is a young SS officer who has come from Italy and Yugoslavia, where his service included high altitude survival. He was a mountain killer. He killed thousands of partisans, communists, and Jews, and he too was on the run. And they lived together for 3.5 years in the Alps, in the Dolomites, above, not far from Salzburg, where by now Charlotte is living. At a certain moment in late 2016, I said to Horst, tell me about this Burkhard Ratman. Who is he? Why did he look after your father? What was their relationship? Did you stay in touch with them after the war years and after your father died? And Horst looked at me and he said, Philippe, I can answer all of your questions about Burkhard Ratman, or we could telephone him. Now, this, I must confess, and still when I say it, takes me aback. It was 2016, 2017. It never occurred to me that Burkhard Ratman could still be alive 70 plus years after their escape with Otto Wächter, but he was. And Horst and I went to visit him in January 2017. And I got a first-hand account of how Otto Wächter escaped and how he made his way to what is known as the Ratline. In the spring of 1949, having hidden for a few weeks in Salzburg, he heads for Rome. And here we enter the world of a detective story, of science fiction, of espionage, Cold War times. Those of you who have read the book will know that I had the great fortune of having as my next door neighbor for more than 20 years, the great spy writer and novelist John le Carré, and I went to see him and sought his advice. He features as a character in the Ratline. He'll be a character in the TV series in due course. And what I learned from this material, which was a lot of work, because by now in 49, Otto Wächter recognizes that he's being hunted by the Americans, by the British, by the Soviets, by the Jews, who want him for mass murder. He's been indicted and he's on the run. So all of his letters home to Charlotta in this period, and he's writing to her at least once a week for many months, the names are all in code. And so we had to spend about 3.5 years decoding the letters. And we did so with 100% success. We worked out who every single person was. And so for the first time with this book, you get a sense of who helped senior Nazis on the run in their desire to get to South America. Wächter never gets to South America, of course, because he dies as he's about to leave in strange circumstances. But we know who helped him. We know, for example, how important a role was played by senior individuals in the Vatican. He was hidden by a bishop, a famous bishop called Alois Hudal, who was also very involved in the case of Mengele and Barbie, and may also have had a role in relation to the escape of Adolf Eichmann. But we also know that the Americans and the British were involved in the Ratline. We know that the Americans and the British used the Ratline as a recruiting tool. And one of the most shocking discoveries that I had going through the files, with tremendous assistance from people in the United States, Eli Rosenbaum, the Department of Justice, the famed Nazi hunter, Professor Norman Goder in the University of Florida, the greatest living researcher on the archives of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Counterintelligence Corps of the United States Army. We discovered that from the moment he arrived in Rome, on April the 29th, 1949, the Americans knew he was there, and they did nothing to apprehend him. Quite the contrary. As John le Carré said to me, when he was hunting for Nazis, it was not to put them on trial for crimes, it was to recruit them in the new struggle against the communists in the Cold War. I found this pretty startling, I have to say, and I think this is one aspect of the book that has caused tremendous interest. It is really a level of detail that we didn't know about. I think it's probably a good idea if I stop there. I've given you a flavor of the whole. I've given you the sense of very much it being a very personal book. I'm in the story. I have a wonderful editor at Alfred Knopf, Vicky Wilson, who gave me very good advice in writing East-West Street, which was to say, Philippe, readers are intelligent. They don't only want to know what you discovered, they want to know how you discovered it. And I tell the story of how I find out information, how you do the detective work, so to speak, and how you discover things. So we can perhaps in the Q&A and in conversation enter into more of the questions that are of interest to you in Michigan and around the United States. But why don't I stop there? And why don't we now put it over back to our dear moderators, who can perhaps ask some introductory questions, and we can then throw it open to the audience. I'd be absolutely delighted to speak with you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Philippe, and all participants. My name is Alan Gershell. I'm a volunteer docent here at the Zuckerman Holocaust Center. Thank you again for a fascinating talk. As you've been advised, please place questions at the bottom, at the Q&A. We'll get to as many as we can. Let me start off by asking you to get the ball rolling here. Obviously, a central theme in your book is how Wächter died. He dies in the hospital on the eve of his leaving. You leave the reader with a lot of thought as to what might have happened. I'm curious, what do you think happened?
Well, we have his medical records. We have the letters he wrote home to describe his condition. So what I did was I took that material, and I suspect in the audience are some medical practitioners or university professors who are expert in these kinds of things. And I got a range of expert evidences. To give you some context, the bishop who looked after Wächter published a memoir 14 years after, actually wrote it 14 years after Wächter's death. It was only published in 1973, 24 years. So it only became public in 1973 that Wächter died in Hudal's arms. And Hudal, the bishop, writes in his memoir that as Wächter lay dying, he told me he had been poisoned by an old comrade who was working for the Americans. I don't want to give too much away here, but that, of course, opened the door to the theory that he had been poisoned, either by the Americans or by the Jews or by the Soviets. We don't know. At the same time, the death certificate describes him as having died of leptospirosis, which is otherwise known as Weil's disease, which you get if you come into contact with rat urine that carries a particular bacteria, particular virus. And those are the two theories. I have to say that I ended up thinking that he had not been poisoned, although the door was left slightly open to that theory. And that the more persuasive evidence, having spoken to quite a few medical practitioners and university professors expert in the symptoms, was that he had indeed died of leptospirosis, probably caught while swimming in the Tiber. He loved to swim, and this was a disease that was prevalent for poisoned water. On the other hand, I have to say, and this is not in the book, I get a huge correspondence of very interesting people from the books that I write. And I did receive a letter about a year after the book came out, so just a year or so ago, from Jerusalem, from a man who was a writer, who described to me how his father-in-law, an Italian Jew who had been born and lived in Rome and had been hidden during the war, emigrated to Palestine in 1946 and returned in the spring of 1949 to work for what became the Mossad, hunting Nazis in Italy, part of a four-man hit squad. And this man, whose name is Sergio Minervi, very renowned character, returns to, well, by then it's Israel, in August 1949, a month after Wächter is dead. And I have to say that this new set of facts has reopened the questions that I have as to whether, in fact, Wächter might indeed have been skillfully poisoned. So the upshot is, it's a great question. I don't know for fact what the answer is. My instinct is he died of leptospirosis, but I cannot exclude the possibility that he was indeed poisoned.
Thank you, Philippe. I'm seeing a bunch of questions now that are showing up here, so let me get to them as many as we can. One of the questions is, can you define the Ratline? It's the title of the book. You explain what it is, but a little bit more background about that title.
Right. So some people on the call on this Zoom will have heard about the Ratline. In short, it describes the route of travel from Italy to South America on which senior and hunted Nazis escaped their pursuers and created a new life for themselves abroad. People who went on the Ratline have notorious names: Joseph Mengele, Klaus Barbie, Erich Priebke, Adolf Eichmann. You know all of the names. And it was a route in which we know a number of senior Vatican individuals played a role in facilitating the transport, the passage from Italy to Brazil, to Argentina, to Chile, by getting them passports, by getting them transportation tickets, and so on and so forth. But what I hadn't known, and I have to confess it came as a bit of a shock, was that in 1947, and I describe this in detail in the book, the United States Army, through an outfit some of you may have heard of called the CIC, the Counterintelligence Corps, and a section run by a man called Thomas Lucid, whose son I also have come to know, wonderful man who lives in in Arizona. Thomas Lucid basically cut a deal with a number of senior officials in something called Project Los Angeles. And I just, to prepare you for this, Project Los Angeles was a real shock to me. Project Los Angeles was run by Thomas Lucid and had as its chief agent a very senior former SS officer called Karl Haas, who may or may not have been the person who was in contact with Wächter and who may or may not have been the person who poisoned Otto Wächter. Karl Haas's network comprised 8 sub-agents. Now, Haas was paid by the Americans $50 in cash a month for 5 years. And he had 8 sub-agents who were also paid $50 a month in cash by the United States. Of those 8 agents, 3 were senior Nazis, 3 were Italian fascists, including the Secretary General of the Fascist Party, who was in prison in Italy, American spy. But most staggeringly, Alois Hudal, the Austrian bishop, the Vatican bishop, very close to Pius XII in earlier years, it turned out was an American spy working for Thomas Lucid, as was Pius XII's chief press spokesperson, a cardinal who was in the pay of the Americans. And of course, that raises the question, the cardinal who was working for the Americans, was he on a frolic of his own, or was he working, if you like, on instructions or with the knowledge of Pope Pius XII? Now, one of the people I've spent a lot of time talking with in writing that book is the wonderful historian David Kurtzer, who's just written a new book on Mussolini and Pius XII and the Nazis and Pius XII. And so you'll be able to read about that yourselves. But in short, there is now, regrettably, no doubt, the Ratline was an escape route for senior Nazis, and the US and the Vatican were deeply involved in its operation.
Thank you. Philippe, there are several questions that center around Charlotte and her relationship with Wächter. Can you tell us whether or not she herself was ever investigated for any kind of complicity with her husband in these crimes?
She was not investigated. She was an active member of the Nazi Party from the earliest of years and a total supporter of what her husband did. And she knew everything that her husband did because he told her everything, including the killing of the Jews. There is a remarkable novel that was initially published in 1944 by an Italian writer called Curzio Malaparte, Malaparte. The book is called Caput, Kaputt. Now, Malaparte was a journalist as well as a novelist, and he worked for the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera. And in 1942, he went to visit Hans Frank and the Wächters, including Charlotte, in Krakow. And he describes going with Charlotte to the Krakow ghetto and taking photographs and meeting people and so on and so forth. So she was, we know, actively involved, an active supporter, and a highly accomplished and artistic woman who was also highly intelligent. She had a very strong relationship with her husband. They had a stormy relationship. He had a lot of affairs. That comes out in the letters and in the materials. She punished him for his affairs. I can give you an example, so you get a sense of these human beings. In 1936, when she arrives in Berlin, she discovers, and she arrives with their 2 young children, she discovers that Otto is having an affair with a young German lady called Traute. And when a year later, Charlotte becomes pregnant again with their 3rd child, and the child is then born, a girl, she decides to name their daughter Traute, as a form of punishing her husband. So as a reader of this material, you get a sense of a very powerful couple, a very stormy relationship. When he dies in 1949, she decides she's going to cleanse his name and his reputation. She, in her diaries, tells how she goes about doing that. And she's very open. For example, apropos your question, in 1945, in May, she's living in Zell am See in Austria. And that town is occupied by American soldiers. She is confronted by American soldiers. And they say to her, "Are you a Nazi, madam?" And she says, "Yes, of course I'm a Nazi. I'm a proud Nazi." And they say to her, "Well, you're the first person who's owned up to that. Everyone else says they weren't." That gives you a sense of Charlotte Wächter. I raise the possibility that she was so supportive of what her husband was doing that the question of her complicity in his crimes definitely arises. The supportive, dutiful, loving spouse, but she was never investigated.
Thank you. Also, continuing with the family type question, there was obviously some frustration. I felt that as a reader with horses and transients as it concerns his father's acts. When you finished the book and he read the book, what was his reaction to your book?
He hates the book. He thinks I've left out all the bits about his dad that show what a marvelous man he was. And this raised for me various ethical concerns. I mean, I'm a university professor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a litigator, so behaving correctly and behaving ethically is a matter of importance for me. So I felt I had to treat him with respect. The understanding we had was that he would give me all of the material and I would write fairly about it, and I would share with the reader his interpretations of the same material. Now, to give the listeners a sense of how skewed Horst's interpretations are, you remember I mentioned the letter he wrote in December 1939 to his wife describing how tomorrow I have to have 50 Poles killed. Horst's interpretation of that line, tomorrow I have to have 50 Poles killed, is, you see, Philippe, he didn't want to kill them. He had to kill them. He was instructed to kill them. Well, I mean, I don't buy that. I think he wanted to kill them. He did kill them. It was a crime, and he entered criminality just in that act alone, notwithstanding the fact there are many other acts. So Horst takes the same material that I look at, and his interpretations are completely different from mine. I don't accept his interpretations, but I had undertaken to make his interpretations available to the reader, and I leave it to the reader to form their own view as to whether they think his interpretations are credible or not. I think they're not, and I make my views on that very, very clear. But there's another person who enters the story late in the day. Horst has one child, a daughter. And as I describe in the book, it's a very powerful and difficult moment. I also made, out of the material in the book, a podcast series, which any of you can listen to on the BBC. It's called The Ratline, and it's available free to listen to. It's a 10-part series. You can hear Horst, he speaks English very well, and so on and so forth. When the final episode was broadcast, episode 10, I received an email from Horst's daughter, Magdalena, his only child. And she said to me, "I've listened to the podcast, I've talked to you, I share your interpretation, not my father's interpretation. My grandfather was a mass murderer." She posts that on Facebook. And following her posting of those words on Facebook, Horst disinherits her. So that gives you a sense of the curious and weird position into which Horst has got himself. He's a sweet man. He is not an evil man. He's not a bad man. ultimately, my interpretation is not that he loves his father and not that he wants to believe that his father was a good man, but that his mother loved his father, he loved his mother, and as an act of, if you like, warped respect for his mother, he's gone out on a limb with an interpretation of his father that is completely unsustainable.
Thank you, Philippe. Along that same line, besides the individuals you've mentioned, in the course of researching your book, have you spoken to other descendants of Nazi leaders? And if so, what are you finding? You've just given us two contrasts between Otto Frank's son and Wächter's son. So what are you seeing? What are you finding?
I'm finding a wide array. So one of the things that I was curious about, the first one that I got to know was Nicholas Frank. And Nicholas told me that all of the children and many of the grandchildren are in contact with each other. It's not formalized as a club or anything, but there are connections. And I have met now many children and many grandchildren. And I would say, with regret, that most people fall between the two camps. Nicholas Frank is exceptional. There are rather more people like Horst, but most of the descendants just don't want to talk about it. They don't want to engage about it. But I've had some remarkable correspondence from individuals who are either children or grandchildren. Kaltenbrunner, von Neuhardt, the former foreign minister of Hitler, children and grandchildren have got in touch. Seyss-Inquart, one of the grandchildren, got in touch. The commandant at Treblinka, where my family was exterminated, the grandson got in touch because I write about that place also. And so I've developed these curious and sometimes a little unsettling relations. But I'm always very polite. You've read the book, you've seen my style. I take the view that the children and the grandchildren are not responsible for the crimes of the parents or grandparents. But they do have a responsibility to engage fairly with the facts. And this level of engagement is very significant. Indeed, one of the things you might want to think of doing as a follow-up is invite, because he comes to the States from time to time, Nicholas Frank. He's an absolutely fascinating human being, a remarkable person. He's become actually a very good friend, and have a live event with him. I did an event at the Los Angeles Museum of the Shoah, and I did an event in Washington at the Holocaust Museum with him. I mean, obviously, hundreds, thousands of people come to that because he's such a fascinating character. But I speak to everyone with an open mind. And one of the things I've come to understand, I grew up in a family of Holocaust survivors. My mother was a hidden child in Paris for 4 years, separated from her parents. And obviously that was a major trauma to go through. I grew up in a household where, for example, as a kid, my brother and I, were not allowed to have anything that was German. I've grown out of that. I've got a new and decent relationship with Germany. I understand my mother's position on these issues. But when I started to meet the children and grandchildren of perpetrators, I came to understand very quickly that generation, those successors, those descendants, are deeply traumatized by what has happened. For example, Nicholas, too, has one child, a wonderful daughter called Francesca, who's become a good friend. And Francesca told me one day that as a child, she used to worry that she had or might have inherited the terrible DNA of her murderous grandfather. And for the first time, meeting Nicholas and Francesca, meeting Horst and Magdalena, I became aware of the burden of what it means, in the case of Nicholas, to have a father who is hanged for the murder of 4 million human beings. How do you live with that in your daily life? It is a huge burden. And so I try to be as generous as I can in understanding what it means to live on the other side of the story.
Philippe, in researching this book and also at East West Street, did you get any sense about how many Nazis might have escaped prosecution because they were recruited to fight communism at the dawn of the Cold War?
Oh, thousands and thousands. I mean, the numbers are just absolutely huge. It's very dispiriting. The world is truly a filthy place. I remember my conversation with Le Carré, and he said to me, yes, I was there in 49 or 50 or whatever it was, and my job was to interrogate Germans and hunt out Nazis, powerful Nazis. And I said, what, to prosecute them? He said, no, to recruit them. And I said, were there many? He said, oh, yes, there were many. And what did you do once you found them? He said, we destroyed their files so they wouldn't be caught, and we used them. Why did you do that? I asked. Because of their Rolodexes, because they knew where the communists were. And so we recruited them to our cause. I think the numbers are vast.
There was a question here that where can we find the BBC documentary you mentioned about Wächter?
You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on Apple. It's called My Nazi Legacy, What Our Fathers Did. It's 90 minutes. It won several prizes. The work of the director will be familiar to some of you. He's actually a university friend of mine, and he's also one of the directors of Downton Abbey. So the style is, it's not my documentary, it's his documentary. And I think it's a brilliant piece of work. It's a very compelling and powerful piece of work. But you can find it, you can get it on Amazon. It's streaming on Amazon and on Apple and various other streaming services.
Philippe, time is beginning to run short. If I could ask you, could you give us a teaser of what you're working on next?
With the greatest happiness. Thank you so much for asking that question. I
Do I
thought
get some of the royalties?
I thought you do. I give you 1% straight away. Those of you who've read my books, you'll know, for example, that Otto Wächter is a minor, tiny character in East West Street. So I take a tiny character in the original book and move on. There is a minor character in the Ratline. It's actually the guy who hid in Rome with Otto Wächter. And he was called Walter Rauff, R-A-U-F-F. And Walter Rauff's claim to fame is particularly horrible. He was the inventor and the builder of the mobile gas chambers that started in 1941 and were used before they built the extermination camps at Sobibor and Belzerch and Treblinka. They used little vans that would gas 40 or 50 people, and that was Rauff's invention. So unlike Wächter, Rauff did escape. He went first to Syria. He wrote to Wächter from Syria. We have the letter. It's an extraordinary letter. And told Wächter, don't go to Syria. It's not a good place for Germans. You need to head to South America. A year later, in 1950, Rauff does go to South America. He goes to Ecuador, small Central American country, and he sets up shop in Quito. And you'll be delighted to know that the inventor of the mobile gas chamber became an auto mechanic working for Mercedes-Benz. He lived there for a few years. And while he was living there, he befriended a Chilean military officer who worked as a sort of military attaché at the Chilean embassy in Ecuador. And the military officer said to him, they became good friends, the two wives became good friends also, said to him, you're in the wrong country. You should not be in Ecuador, you should be in Chile, because we like Germans like you in Chile. Go to Chile. And 2 years later, in 1958, Wächter went to Chile. He set up shop in southern Chile, in a town called Punta Arenas, the southernmost town in the whole world. Coincidentally, I'm heading there tomorrow to do research for this book, flying there from London via Santiago. Rauff, in 1963, was the subject of an extradition procedure which failed. The West German government wanted to bring him back to Germany for trial for crimes against humanity and genocide, but the statute of limitations cut in, and so they could not extradite him. And so he carried on his life as the manager and part owner of a fish cannery. And then in 1973, on September the 11th, a different September the 11th, but a very important one in the life of Chile, his friend, the military officer, became president of Chile because his friend was called Augusto Pinochet. And what then happened, by rumor, is that Ralph started working as an interrogator and torturer for Augusto Pinochet. And that is the subject of the next book, because 25 years later, in 1998, as you may remember, Augusto Pinochet traveled to London for medical assistance. He had an illness. And on the 16th of October, 1998, he was arrested in London and subject to extradition proceedings to be sent to Spain. And that case landed on my desk. So there was a direct connection now with the work that I've done and with Ralph. So the next book tells the story of Augusto Pinochet in London and Walter Ralph in Punta Arenas and Santiago. The story goes on and on.
Thank you, Philippe. Our time is up. So let me thank you on behalf of the museum and our listeners for a wonderful and fascinating discussion. If any of you would like to order a copy of the book Ratline, we have posted a link in the chat you can order from. Thank you to our program supporters and donors. We are able to offer events free of charge because of the generosity of caring supporters like many of you. Please consider making a donation by visiting www.holocaustcenter.org/support. We invite all of you to join us on Sunday, November 13th, for our 38th anniversary benefit, which will take place at Huntington Place in downtown Detroit. We are pleased to announce that presidential historian and Pulitzer Prize-winning author John Meacham will be the keynote speaker. To purchase tickets, please visit holocaustcenter.org. Thank you for watching and have a great day.